in anything. My father, as I said, was so strict, and was no point in even asking that question. You know, may I go do this? May I get involved? And we knew the answer would be no, and so the answer was no for everything. Unless you said, may I go to school? The answer was no for everything. You know, I said something to him about dating once, and he looked at me and said, dating? What? So I never dated. When I finished high school, my prom date, his father picked me up. He came to the house. The father was driving the car. We sat in the back seat, and he took us to the prom when the prom was over, you know. So this was the life I led. Now, the boys' life was very different, my 4 brothers, but because of just his being so strict, I understand now why he was that way. But I would spend a lot of time at the church. So I just happened to be there when the first mass meeting took place. And I was back working in the little office. You went there today, so if we're facing the pulpit.
They didn't go today.
Oh, they didn't go?
Just outside.
Oh, just the outside, okay.
Todd gave us strict instructions.
Oh, okay. I know Todd can really keep in line. Well, if you were inside facing the pulpit, there's exit. There are 2 doors on either side of the pulpit, and they both say exit. But on the right, once upon a time, if you went through that door, that's where the church office was. Today, the church office, as you saw, is next door. But that was a parsonage when I was there. There was actually, the preacher was actually living there with his family, his children. But I worked in that little office, and when the church was bombed, there were steps on the outside that led upstairs to that office. So all the guests came in that way, but when the church was bombed, those steps were blown away. And when we renovated, we didn't put those steps back. We also sealed off the bathroom. At the time of the church bombing, there were over 80 unsolved bombings in Birmingham. And no one had been taken to justice for any of those bombings. And so we didn't think anybody would be held accountable for the church bombing. So to not have such a horrific memory of what happened in that space, we just put a wall there, we just sealed it off. But on the day that I was working there, I heard what I called fiery speeches out in the sanctuary, and I heard music. And so when I went to the door and looked out, the church was full. The balcony, entire balcony was full, the lower level was full. And the best thing it was full of young people, like yourselves, you know. They were actually a lot younger than you guys. Some of them 12, 13, 14, they were very young. But I knew a lot of them. Some of them lived in my neighborhood. Some of them went to my school. Some of them were members of the church but lived in other areas. But it was people I knew. And when you see children, young people generate a lot of energy. And when you see this, you just get excited. You want to be part of it. So I really wasn't sure at the time what this was going to be. But I just felt like I wanted to be part of it. So I put everything aside, and I came out and took a seat out in the sanctuary. And seated on the podium there, on the pulpit, were 6 men. There was Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. There was Reverend Jesse Jackson. There was Reverend Ralph Abernathy. There was James Bevel, Reverend James Bevel, Reverend Andrew Young, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And each one gave a speech of some sort. Dr. King talked a lot about nonviolence, talked about removing the segregation, not just the signs, but the segregation itself, you know, ridding Birmingham. Reverend Shuttlesworth used to say, break the back of segregation. We aim to break the back of segregation. And so each one of them gave their own message. James Bevel talked about the young people being involved and marching, and that you would hear things later, and they would let us know when it was time. They talked about the importance of not having things that, carrying things that could be perceived as weapons or that would, you know, get you in trouble. And after listening to that, we had someone that came out and we sang the freedom songs, different songs. Songs like Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Freedom, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. You've probably heard all of these at some point in time. And once we did all of that, when the meeting was dismissed, everybody was free to go, but we were just told, you will know when it's time. We'll let you know, you'll know when it's time. Well, the very next day, they showed up at my high school. They showed up all over the city in different places. But they just had a big poster board sign, and the sign said, it's time. So if you had attended that meeting, we had our local black DJs were involved in this because they were doing a little broadcasting on the radio. Make sure you got your toothbrush today. Didn't know if they were going to be arrested or what. But most of the word has spread pretty rapidly, I think. Now, Dr. King requested James Bevel to come in and work with the young people, but they had not really made a decision that young people were going to be the real force of the movement. Reverend Shuttlesworth has been dead now about 5 years, but I had the privilege of doing several speeches and traveling a few places with him before he died. And so I got a lot of these stories firsthand. He talks about the fact that they were arguing the night before because many people felt those children are going to get hurt. And everybody's going to blame you. You're sending these kids out there to do things that adults won't even do, you know, and they argued. And to his recollection, he said when they kind of finally retired late in the night, early in the morning, they really hadn't made a decision on what they wanted to do. But what they had done was invite James Bevel, this was his specialty, you know, this was exactly what he did wherever he was. And so Bevel had already gotten the word out, and that next day they showed up at the schools, and the kids it was too late, you know, the kids were on their way out. So when they came to our school, I am a graduate of Parker High School, it's the first black high school here in Birmingham, and when they came to our school, most of us climbed fence, so whatever you had to do, walk out the front door, or just leave the campus. And we marched in the area of the church, toward the church. And when we reached, I remember that we were stopped one time on 8th Avenue near a little store that was called the Atlantic Thrift Center, and Atlantic Mills Thrift Center, and we were stopped by police that wanted to break up the march. But eventually we made our way onto the church, and when we got to that area, right across from the church, you guys saw Kelly Ingram Park today. Then Bull Connor was waiting with his firemen and fire hoses. He was waiting with the little white tank. If you didn't go inside the church, there are pictures of that little white army tank inside, but if you didn't go inside, you wouldn't have seen that. And of course, the police had police dogs, and we had been told pretty much what to watch for. The policemen may have billy clubs, they may have dogs. But I just remember thinking when they brought out those water hoses that no one had said anything to us about water hoses. And so we were wet and swished around and whatnot, and there were lots of children in the church, but as those that were out in the area where the confrontations were taking place, as they retreated back into the church, they go downstairs into the basement, more would come out. And so over a period of time, the records tell us that over 5,000 children were arrested. They ranged in ages from 8 years old to 80 years old. There is one record of a 4-year-old that was also arrested. And one of the things that they said during the mass meeting, be prepared to stay for at least a week, because they didn't know, you know, they just didn't have all the plans worked out. People have to be bailed out of jail, but ultimately they had 2 bail bondsmen. One of them lived on this, well, actually both of them lived on the street where I grew up. But the money that came from all over the country went to those bondsmen, and they kept that so that they could get people out of jail. Well, I think the turning point, I want to just kind of bring in an aside. When all of this was over, Nelson Mandela came, not Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu came to Birmingham, and he brought F.W. de Klerk with him. So we had a reception at the Institute for them, and I remember Reverend Shuttlesworth, F.W. Desmond Tutu said that when the children in South Africa saw the children of Birmingham on television, they purposed in their heart, their spirit, if they can do it, we can do it. When they saw the children standing up for their rights, he told us that in person. And Reverend Shuttlesworth, I remember, asked F.W. de Klerk the question, well, how did you feel? You know, apartheid was ending, and you know, in a sense, you saw the train coming down the track, and how did you feel after all these years? Did you think it would work? And F.W. de Klerk said something to the effect, well, I saw it coming. I knew I couldn't stop it, so I just got on the train. And so Reverend Shuttlesworth didn't like that response. He says, well, you know, it's kind of like you can at least pretend that it was the right thing to do. And he said it out loud. He said, you won't even pretend like that was the right decision to make, you know. It's kind of a controversy about it in later years. But after the numbers I was telling you, or the 5,000 were arrested, we remember that President Kennedy was our president that year, well, at that time, in that season, and that he came on national TV, and he gave us a challenge. He said, this is a moral challenge, and it's an old challenge. It's you know, a biblical challenge in a sense. Are we going to ensure that the liberties that we've required for all citizens of this great country, are we going to say that those liberties are just for some people and not all people? We've got to make a decision about that. And if I could say that differently, we're at a crossroads now. We're really at a serious stopping point here. We need to make up our mind. And so I think most of America felt that the decision was, yeah, we're going to try to afford those citizens to everybody. But after the president made that speech, I think, I want to say 2 to 3 weeks after that was when the bombing of the church occurred. Now, remember what I said, there were over 80 unsolved bombings. No one had made any attempt to find out who was doing it. All of these bombings fell in 3 categories. They were either black homes, black businesses, or black churches. And I have it in my book, but I just wanted to, this letter from E.W. Oliver, for those of you that have read it, you remember there's a letter in there. I talk about E.W. Oliver. He's a pastor who just happened to be in that vicinity after the bombing of the church. And he sat down, he had written several letters to President Kennedy, and he says, you know, there's a lot going on down here. They're bombing places, and he wanted someone from Washington to come to Birmingham and take a look at what was going on. So some of the dates, and in front of your book, you can see everything for that particular year. In 1963, I listed everything that was going on. But these are the words of E.W. Oliver from your book, but I really wanted to just read some of these places that were bombed. He said, on the morning of the bombing, I stood across the street from the church behind carbine-bearing policemen and watched as the covered bodies were placed into waiting ambulances. Women drove a small crowd of people off the, policemen drove a small crowd of people off the street. I got onto a nearby porch. Women, seeing the covered bodies being brought from the church, cried and screamed without restraint. I could not bring my eyes to believe my mind to believe what my eyes saw. It still seems like a tale from some distant land where people know nothing about freedom or democracy. Now, what follows, he says, on September 1963, September 19th, after the bombing, I sent a letter to President Kennedy cataloging some of the horrible events which have afflicted and continue to afflict our citizens. March 1st, a Negro home destroyed by a bomb. March 11th, A.G. Gaston Motel bombed. March 11th, same day, the home of Reverend A.D. King, Dr. King's brother, bombed. August 14th, a tear gas bomb dropped in Loveman's department store following the desegregation of the eating facilities. August 20th, the bombing of Arthur Shore's home. There's a whole list here. I mean, I'm not going to try to read them all, but I wanted to just give you some idea of, even he mentions things like the firing of 12 shots into the home of Francis Garrett by Birmingham police, attempting to make people get off the street and into the houses. So Birmingham was just a place of chaos, great chaos. In 1948, Birmingham was totally segregated, and the dividing line was in a little place called Smithfield. But the story is that whites lived on one side of the line, blacks lived on the other side. And someone in real estate either accidentally or purposely sold a home to a black person that crossed that dividing line. And that's when the Klan started these bombings. That's when the first bomb exploded. So all of the rest of the things that I was reading to you just happened continuously from 1948 on up to 1963. And I think the last bomb that I know about exploded in 1964. Well, on the morning of the bombing, I arrived at church with two younger brothers. Alan was 6 and Wendell was 10. I was 14. And you know, basically I would come in, put them in their Sunday school class, and then I'd go to the office, get my materials to pass out so that later I could record attendance and record offering, and I could read that report when Sunday school reconvened. So I did that on this Sunday morning, and after I passed everything out, I went and sat in my Sunday school class. Now, you didn't go into the church, but downstairs there's a gift shop, and my class in 1963 would have been the gift shop. But at 10:15 I got up, collected everything downstairs from the youth classes, headed upstairs, past the bathroom where the girls were, spoke to them. We were all very excited. I didn't linger there because there were two things going on. It was Youth Day in the church, which meant that we were in charge of everything, from the singing to the praying to the ushering, everything. The second thing, Cynthia Wesley and myself were in a club, and we had a very special club meeting going on that day at 3 o'clock. As a matter of fact, we had one black newspaper, and they had allowed us to put an article in the paper. And the article said, Cavalet's Club to meet Sunday, September 15th, 1963 at 3 o'clock. So that same Sunday, we would have been going to that meeting. And you know, we would go and play records and dance. I mean, it was a big deal to us. But the bigger deal was that article that they let us put in the paper because it listed all of our names. And no other club in Birmingham had been able to do that. So we thought that was a big deal. The other thing, the lesson for that day was a love that forgives. It was taken from the text of Luke 24, the passage that says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So we studied our Sunday school lesson. That was also the title of the pastor's sermon that day. It was on the marquee. But we would not get a chance to hear the sermon. And if I fast forwarded that for you again, if I went over to 2013 when we reflected on 50 years, one of the things that we did was send out all types of communication with that scripture lesson, that passage, everything that was taught in 1963 on that Sunday, a love that forgives. We asked preachers all over the country to make that their lesson again for Sunday school and for church. We just felt that praying in community, teaching in community, that same lesson was a great way to reflect on 50 years ago, but also to just acknowledge that was something we certainly didn't ever want to see happen again. So when I passed the girls and went upstairs, I was about to walk out into the sanctuary, passing the office, but the phone rang. And the caller, when I peeped in, the lady that I worked for, Mrs. Mabel Shorter, was not in the office, so I answered the phone, and there was a male caller on the other end who said 3 minutes. And as quickly as he said that, he hung up. But I was holding materials that I needed to create a report for him, so I stepped out into the church, took about 15 steps at the beginning of that first aisle, and that's when the bomb exploded. Church has carpeted floors today, but back then we had hardwood floors. We didn't have any seating on the pews, no padding on the pews, so you could hear everything. When the bomb first exploded, we heard a lot of screams, but I heard someone say hit the floor, and it got very quiet for what just probably was about 5 or 10 seconds, but it was just deathly quiet. And then because of the hardwood floors, you could hear people getting up, running out. The FBI report says there were about 75 people at Sunday school at that time. The bomb exploded at 10:22. We know that because the clock stopped. And so people began, my first thought was for those two little brothers. They had come to Sunday school with me, and I knew in my house there was no such thing as coming home without, if 3 people left home, 3 had to return. No such thing as I don't know where he is, I don't know where she is. And so that, I was just frantically all over the place outside looking for those 2 younger brothers. And to shorten this story, in what would happen later, the 10-year-old would run toward town, but my father, going to his second job to wait tables, when he arrived there, the people told him, hey, they just bombed your church. So he got in the car and came back home, not home, but toward the church, and he encountered the 10-year-old. 10-year-old was running away from the church. My father was coming, trying to get to the church to see where we were. The 6-year-old went the opposite direction in the back of the church, and the person that he encountered was not someone he knew, but when I was growing up, there were only, my maiden name was Maull, M-A-U-L-L. There were only 3 in the phone book. So my brother could tell you his name and everything, and he was able to call my mother, and he says, I have this little guy here. He just, first person he met, he just grabbed his leg, he wouldn't turn him loose, he didn't know the man or anything. But we had to wait for my father to take us home, and then take the car and come back and get my younger brother after this man had called. I didn't know when I left the church that anybody had been hurt. I had gone back inside the church several times looking for the brothers, but I didn't know that anybody had been hurt. And then I did hear somebody say, I think it's people hurt in there, but I thought they were just kind of being dramatic. Again, now, you know, looking at the ages that we were. And when I got home, it would be around 3:30 that Sunday, that same Sunday, that my mother would get a call saying that the girls had not made it out of the bathroom. And that's when we learned that they had not made it out. What we also didn't know at that time was there were actually 5 girls in the bathroom. We know that 4 of them died. Those are the 4 that you hear about. The 5th girl survived. She was 12 years old, but she was in a different part of the bathroom, and many of us think that she probably survived because she was in that different, the bathroom was separated into the part where the toilets were, that was one room, it was 3 toilets, but then there was like a lounge area. The girls that were killed were in the lounge area, where the sofa and the freestanding mirror was, and that one person was in the bathroom. I didn't attend the funeral. They called the house several times, and my mom kept saying, are you sure? Are you sure? I was so frightened. There's only one word that I can give you that would just describe what I was for probably the next 20 years. Not just that Sunday, but the next 20 years. We could be sitting on our porches sometime or on the curb. We like to sit on the curb, my brothers and I. You could be doing that any evening, and all of a sudden you would hear this horrific boom out there somewhere. It just felt like the earth moved, just boom. And we'd all look around because we knew the sound. Birmingham was full of bombs, so we knew whenever a bomb exploded, we knew what it was. And everyone would we just start looking at each other because we also knew in a little while the phone would ring. And when the phone rang, somebody would call and say, call one of these names that I read to you. They just bombed the A.G. Gaston Motel, or they just bombed the home of Dr. King's brother, A.D. King. And so when we, that was on Sunday, September 15th, 10/22, 1963. Monday morning, we were back in school. We were in school at 8 o'clock. We did not have a moment of silent prayer. We did not have a moment to sit and talk and say, well, this is how it made me feel, or here's what I think about it. We just didn't get to talk about it at all.